LSP alumni and alumni, Assalamu alaikum. October is Domestic Violence Prevention Month, and so I'm delighted to welcome Ms. Aisha Rahman to this month's Lunch and Learn program. As many of you know, Ms. Rahman was KARAMAH's executive director for 6 years. During her tenure, she established KARAMAH as a leading source of culturally sensitive information and training to organizations providing services to women from a variety of Muslim American communities who've been subjected to domestic and sexual violence. Ms. Rahman was born and raised in Tennessee. She moved to Atlanta for college, where she attended Emory University. At Emory, she developed her interest in family law, particularly on issues relating to domestic violence. In college, she interned at Raksha and the NAACP's Washington Bureau. For those of my viewers who may not be familiar with Raksha, it's a Georgia-based nonprofit with a mission to promote a stronger and healthier South Asian community through confidential support services, education, and advocacy. Raksha works toward healing, empowerment, and justice for survivors of violence. Both internships developed her keen interest in civil rights, social justice, and women's rights. For law school, Ms. Rahman returned to Knoxville, Tennessee, where she attended the University of Tennessee College of Law. After law school, Ms. Rahman launched her legal career at Legal Aid of East Tennessee, serving indigent survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault in matters related to family law, where she remained for 2 years. During her tenure at Legal Aid, Tennessee introduced an anti-Sharia bill, and Ms. Rahman worked with various community organizations to educate the Tennessee legislature on the xenophobic, illegal tenor of this bill. This advocacy also introduced her to Dr. Aziz Al-Hibri and KARAMAH, who were educating communities nationally about the anti-Sharia movement and its negative impact on the civil rights of American Muslims. This led Ms. Rahman to being recruited to join the KARAMAH team. Ms. Rahman moved to Atlanta in November of 2017, where she joined the Bay firm as of counsel. Ms. Rahman currently handles complex family law matters, including divorce, custody, child support, Islamic marriage contracts, and other related matters. She continues to provide family law trainings to judges, lawyers, and advocates on a national level. Dear Aisha, it's so good to see you again.
It's so good to see you.
After all this time, inshallah, in person in 22. I don't think it's safe to do it in person just yet.
That's right. I hope so, inshallah. I'm meeting my people.
Exactly. I am delighted you're able to join me today and share with me and our viewers your views on the extent of the problem of DV in the US, and in particular, the special needs and problems facing American Muslim women, survivors of domestic and/or sexual assault. But before we get into the nitty-gritty, I noticed from your bio that you became interested in DV issues as a very young woman. What was it about this issue that grabbed your attention?
Well, I don't know that I was so interested in the issue of DV as much as I was interested in just globally women's rights issues. I think that when I was in college, I was hungry for, I had that fire in my belly at age 18 to try to do something in the world, and was really interested in women's rights work. And a friend of mine, actually a friend of KARAMAH's, his name is Adnan Zulfikar, you know him.
Oh, yes.
He was a mentor to me, still is a mentor to me, but was a mentor to me even back then, and had told me about an organization in Atlanta called Raksha that I may be interested in. And it's interesting. So that's how I got introduced to Raksha. I applied for an internship. And while I was there, I will never forget what captured my attention about DV. And that was, of course, at age 18, 19, I was young. It was my first internship in college. I had these sort of rose-tinted glasses about our legal system and justice and these kind of broader concepts of civil rights. And so I remember that there was a client of Raksha's that needed interpretation. She spoke Hindi, and I speak Urdu, which is very closely related to Hindi. And she needed to be accompanied to her lawyer's office, and she needed an interpreter. And at the time, Raksha didn't have, or on that particular day, didn't have someone that could go with her, and asked if I would be willing to do that, which was really, beyond kind of the normal scope of what an intern does. And so I was happy to go. And I will never forget thinking, we were talking about very important concepts. It was, her life. It was her money, her children, her immigration status. It was, a conversation with her attorney that was going to hopefully get these rights that she was entitled to. And I was the conduit to relay these messages. And it was just very heavy. And that kind of burden of responsibility, I felt that burden of responsibility just really intensely during that meeting, because I thought, if I don't adequately capture not only her words, but interpretation is about so much more than just language.
Yes.
And it was just the feeling and the emotion that was going into what she was trying to convey to her attorney. She might not have gotten, the message across. And so that moment in time is what I really think about, was what sealed the deal for me in realizing the magnitude of the problem of domestic violence, and also just particularly from the legal aspect, was there a way to get this woman some modicum of justice? So that's how I got interested.
How long ago was this approximately?
Yeah. So I was in college. I started college in 2001. And so it was the summer, it would have been 2002. So a long time, almost 20 years.
Yeah. Well, we'll get into it a little bit more later, but just in a word, have we managed to improve the legal landscape, or do you feel we're still stuck where we were 20 years ago?
I mean, I think we're still stuck. You wanted one word. I would say still stuck. We'll definitely explore it more. I mean, I think that seeing it now as a practitioner, and I've practiced for quite a long time at this point. The systemic and institutional barriers that survivors face, we're making some progress. There's some movement, because I don't want to discount the work of so many advocates, so many organizations like KARAMAH, who have been around for, 25, 30 years, even longer in some cases, that are really trying to move the needle. And I think that we collectively should be proud of the work that we're doing to try to make policy change and change some of these issues. Even something like language access, to what I've been talking about before. We're doing better. We're doing better than we were probably 20 years ago. But overall, the situation is still very dire, and our institutions are still very flawed. There's a lot of work left to do.
Well, hey, at least it's not boring.
Certainly not that.
Thank you for sharing something of your personal journey with us today. But now, as promised, to the nitty-gritty. Can you give us some context about the incidence of DV in the United States generally, and also in the Muslim community in particular? Assuming, of course, that such figures exist. And also tell us something about the Muslim American community groups that you work with and some of the particular challenges that they face.
Sure. So I think that I want to point to two amazing organizations that are currently working on getting statistics. One of the challenges the American Muslim community has had holistically, whether it's on the issue of domestic violence or other issues, is that there are not many organizations that are working on data collection. And so we've relied previously on organizations like Pew and some of the sort of historical organizations that are doing some, quantitative analysis and studies on various issues in our communities. And unfortunately, we still are just lacking in this data collection and data mining world. But to my understanding, Peaceful Families Project, which is based in Northern Virginia, is currently working on a study studying the incidence of domestic violence, particularly in the American Muslim community. So look out for that study. It has not been published yet, but I'm hoping that we'll get better numbers. And then HEART, an organization that Karamah is very familiar with as well, is doing a study that should be released next year. Unofficially, it's unpublished, but I've gotten some of the statistics from that study. I've been able to review them. And that's particularly about sexual assault. So not necessarily domestic violence, but sexual assault, particularly in the American Muslim community. What I can tell you from my viewing of that study, or the initial kind of unpublished numbers, is unfortunately incidents of sexual assault far exceed even the CDC's numbers for the United States not globally, the United States nationally. At the American Muslim community. Of course, the study is very comprehensive. It looks at what is sexual assault, how it's defined, various kind of the spectrum of sexual harassment to penetration and rape, and everything that falls in between. And so
grooming and all that other stuff.
Correct. So certainly they do an amazing job of really breaking down the data to understand what we're talking about. So certainly look out for that. But in my experience, what I will say is that the American Muslim community is no different than any other community in the United States in terms of experiencing domestic violence and sexual assault, struggling with it. I think the unique problems that our community has is the stigma surrounding the topic. And Karamah has been instrumental in this. I know when I was there, we did an amazing program called Love Like the Prophet. I'm sure you remember that, Sarah.
I do.
It is a very good program. And that program was powerful because it reframed the issue of domestic violence by instead talking about the paradigm of marriage and relationships in Islam, and how it's supposed to be one of mercy, of peace, of love,
mutual respect.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And not only in the context of marriage. I mean, I think that what was beautiful about Love Like the Prophet was, I'll never forget, we had one scholar who spoke entirely about the legacy of the Prophet Muhammad and how he treated animals, for example, how he treated just the ground that he walked on. It was not just your intimate partner. It was your companions, your friends, the earth, the gentility with which we are supposed to approach all the many gifts that God has given us is just so woven into the fabric of our faith. And so, of course, when you turn a lens to the most sacred covenant, which is that of marriage, how could it possibly be that there is so much violence and abuse? It's so antithetical to our faith and our values. And so,
in fact, a violence and abuse that's sanctioned and often upheld by religious authorities that victims frequently turn to, only to be told that there is nothing that can be done, or that they just need to endure.
Right. Or they're the ones doing the assault themselves.
Yes.
So
yes.
I know you are familiar with the organization FACE. I think that Karamah is doing maybe another series or another lunch and learn with their executive director, Alia. And she explores, and their organizations explore, the incidents of violence that are happening from leaders, particularly spiritual leaders. It's very disappointing as a Muslim woman who is very proud to be in this community. I'm raising a beautiful little Muslim daughter, and she, inshallah, is going to find Muslim leadership that can instill a love for the Quran, a love for the Prophet Muhammad, and just a love for our faith. And I think it's just very disappointing that the abuse is sometimes at the hands of people who are teaching us about our faith.
Well, now that we have an overview of the DV problem in America,
Mhm.
could you tell us a bit more about the landscape of community-based organizations that provide services? I know that, 20 years ago, they were pretty thin on the ground, but it's my impression that almost everywhere in the United States, actual grassroots organizations run by and for Muslim Americans for the benefit of Muslim American, victims of domestic violence. They've been springing up kind of like mushrooms after the rain.
Yeah. So yeah, I'm happy to talk about that. I'll talk about Atlanta. Atlanta has an amazing organization called Newer Family Services. My privilege to be affiliated with NFS. We call it NFS for short. I do a lot of legal services for NFS, and it's exactly to your point, a community-based organization born out of the need in the greater Atlanta community for comprehensive services for Muslims. We don't only serve Muslims, of course. We're an organization that will serve anyone who needs us, anyone who comes to our doors. One of the incredible things that NFS is doing is that it really is distinguishing itself as a legal services organization. So there are, many organizations, and as you know, domestic violence survivors have all kinds of needs.
Yes.
They might health services, they may need rent assistance, they may need
job training, language assistance, ESL, gosh, all kinds of things.
Yes. So NFS is working with organizations like Raksha. So even 20 years later, Raksha is still around.
Still going strong.
Yes. So I'm still working with Raksha. There's a few others in the Atlanta area, Family Haven, Tapestry, other organizations. And what's great is that when they have a survivor client that needs legal services, they refer them to NFS. And so while the founders of NFS are Muslim, the attorney, of course, me, is Muslim, we're a Muslim founded organization working with survivors of all creed, color, and ethnicity, gender, etc. And I think that that's also just a great precedent to set in the community, that we as Muslims have a calling and a larger obligation to serve people, serve humanity. But to your point of the particular issues that Muslim survivors are experiencing, we have an organization here that can address those needs. And those are issues of enforcing the mahar in American courts. If there is certainly, a client who may feel that religion is being used as a tool of oppression, coming to someone who is Muslim to be your service provider, who actually finds a lot of strength in faith, can be very empowering to kind of, again, shift that narrative. And so instead of it being something that is abusive, using Islam as a tool to empower is also very powerful. So that's, in terms of organizations on the ground, there are others like a Muslim Women's Organization in Orlando, Florida. There's Texas Muslim Women's Fund by another LSP alum. She just there. Her name is Hind. Just amazing Muslim women doing amazing things nationwide.
So if you were, let's say, a woman in Kansas City or something, you were experiencing domestic violence, how would you go about trying to find an organization that understands you as well as how to navigate the US legal system that you would have to be dealing with in order to get services. What would you say to someone there?
So as a lawyer, Sarah, you know that jurisdiction matters in the law. Not all of our alums are lawyers. So briefly, I can speak to the fact that laws differ from one state to another. So Missouri, the laws of Missouri may or may not be the same as the laws of Georgia, may or may not be the same as the laws of DC, et cetera. And so my first, advice to the person is if you're looking for legal services, you're going to need to avail yourself of a legal aid organization, or if you have the means, a private family law attorney in Kansas City. And that's just a simple Google search of looking for, and there is a National Association of Muslim Lawyers that both of us are a part of. They have a listserv. If you need help, you can always email someone that is a Muslim lawyer, even in another jurisdiction, and say, can you put out feelers on the NUMO list? And that's one way of finding a Muslim attorney if you would like one in your particular state or city. But beyond just the legal services, if you're looking for what I call a KARAMAH technical assistance, if you're looking for someone who can help to advise you on your religious rights and things of that nature, KARAMAH is an amazing resource. I think that while KARAMAH may not be able to provide you with legal advice in your particular jurisdiction, we have, and I'm using the collective we have the amazing articles written by Dr. Al-Hibri, written by Abid Awad, written by Dr. Zainab Alwani that are available on KARAMAH's website that really do provide a lot of context for Islam with respect to women's rights, with respect to domestic violence, with respect to divorce and legal services that you might be able to get in a more general context. So, coupling the actual on the ground legal services and advice with the local attorney with a broader understanding through scholarly articles from KARAMAH can really help a person out, and has helped multitudes of women over the years. I know that I still get emails from people who know about KARAMAH, have read KARAMAH's work, of the various scholars that KARAMAH has published, and how empowering it was for them to just have access to scholarship that is empowering. So that's what I would suggest.
Well, I hope everybody's listening, because that's a really good roadmap for anybody who's living in an area which doesn't have a Muslim-based community group that's providing this kind of service.
Right.
So Aisha, my generation had a slogan that the personal is political. And now that you're a new wife and mother yourself, has that changed your perspective in any way?
Oh, I think yes. So I will say that, I was blessed before I became a wife and a mother. I'll talk a little bit about my upbringing. Alhamdulillah, I grew up in a very loving home. I have, alhamdulillah, 2 loving parents who have a beautiful marriage. They recently celebrated over 40 years of marriage. And just really exemplify to me the power of partnership, and all of that means from an Islamic perspective, especially. And so I knew early on, even at Legal Aid, when I first started doing this work, I went to court and I saw people from our community. They were surprised to see me. I was a young lawyer. I didn't see that face of our small community in Tennessee. That was a whole different side of the world that I saw, going to my local mosque and hanging out with our family friends, seeing people in the courthouse dealing with very real issues of domestic violence, of There is a community leader I'll never forget who was accused of rape that I saw a trial for. And I think he was very surprised to see me in the courtroom. Like, what are you here? Because it was just, it's, even though it's a small community, it was a very, the courthouse was just not a place that you went or that Muslims were necessarily frequenting. It was a place that you just didn't think that you were going to see someone that you knew. So I remember at the time I was living at home with my family, and I remember just processing those cases, those stories. It was hard, but at least I got to come home to a place that was secure and in a loving environment. Then I came to DC and I saw globally, I mean, Karamah's work is global. Before COVID times, I had the privilege of going to Lebanon and Morocco and all over the world, Maldives, Brussels with Dr. El-Hibri, especially. I traveled the world and saw that unfortunately the plight of Muslim women was, it's a global issue. We have a lot of universality in the problems that we face. And it was harder because I was living alone. I was not in a relationship at the time. I was, and processing those stories and just that.
It takes it out of you.
It does take it out of you. It does. And so I think this is just a little note to all of you doing the work and listening, definitely take time to take care of yourself. Self-care is so important. Taking care of your mental health is so important. And then now, my life has changed yet again. And I am, alhamdulillah, married. I never really talk about it. I talk about my personal life now. I feel like most of it has been in isolation or in quarantine.
The last 20 months have been hard.
Certainly has. But, what I will say about my life now is that I really attribute a lot of what I know about marriage and partnership to what I learned at Karamah. I think Dr. El-Hibri, particularly her work on marriage in Islam, her scholarship, and just studying with her. I had the privilege of studying with her almost daily for those 6 years that I was at Karamah. It really transformed my notions of marriage, my notions of partnership, and just kind of solidified what I already knew from my own family. But, I was very prepared to negotiate my own marriage contract, to not change my last name,
without asking Abid to consult.
Not asking. I could. He would have. He'll take my
absolutely.
Make sure you get it up front.
That's
whatever.
Right.
I literally wearing my mahar because I was like, I'm not putting anything in the contract that's a later or a delay.
Right.
So, I think that I was prepared in that way. And then, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala blessed me with a beautiful daughter. She's 6 months old. And I think a lot. My husband and I spent a lot of time thinking about what we're teaching her, the books that we're reading to her. I mean, even now, like even in the womb, but even now, just kind of preparedness, how do we make sure that she understands that she's not financially dependent or emotionally dependent on anybody other than God and herself? And if we're lucky and we've prepared, as my husband says, he doesn't want her to know that we've prepared for her. He's like, she'll learn about that. That'll just be icing on the cake. But for now, she needs to stand on her own 2 feet. So, I think
to be more correct, she's now on 4 feet, but 4 feet, soon she'll stand on her own 2 feet, inshallah.
But yes, I think in a nutshell, I do think the personal is political. I think that realizing your blessings and also just what you have, it's something that is applied every day. I mean, I talk about my cases every day in my home, because that's just a way for me to process what's going on. I think, we talked a little bit about in the introduction of kind of getting into the nitty gritty. I recently had a case. I wrote about it. It's a blog post that I'll share with KARAMAH, that Heart is publishing. And it's about a case that I had a couple of weeks ago. I was so moved by the experience that I just needed to write something. I mean, I wasn't even commissioned. It was just something that was flowing literally out of my pores, because it was a Muslim woman. It is a Muslim woman who went through a terrible incident of violence, just terrible abuse. And it's a 2018 case. So imagine, it's a 2018 case that just was set for trial about a month ago. So 3 years later, we went to trial. It was on Zoom. So in this new COVID context, we had the trial and the interpreters didn't show up. So both parties had requested interpreters. Neither showed up. So we were reset. Luckily, we got a reset date for just a couple of weeks later. And we went to a court again, got online, got on Zoom. Interpreters were there. One interpreter, the Arabic interpreter for my client, was phenomenal. She had a phone and a computer. She was technologically prepared, ready to go. But the husband's interpreter, the Farsi interpreter, only had a phone, didn't have a computer, didn't have two devices. And the long and the short of it is, he wasn't audible. You couldn't hear him very well. And so right in the middle of trial, the judge declared a mistrial, just out of nowhere. There was no conversation. I mean, there was a very brief conversation at the beginning of the call that the county had invested in. There's like an interpreter function on some of these other platforms to kind of fix this issue of us talking and then you talking to somebody else and interpreting simultaneously. But of course, that day it wasn't working, that function. And so long story short, we didn't have effective communication. And we, instead of postponing the trial or pausing it, he just called a mistrial and declared that we probably, given the various moving parts of interpreters and lawyers on both sides and multiple witnesses, we probably needed to reset the case for a date when we could all be together in person. And he said in a very political comment that given the landscape of the other and opinions of other judges in that county, we probably weren't going to be heard until 2023.
Oh my God.
So for my client who has been waiting
3 years already,
3 years already for this justice, to have to wait for another 2 years for justice that may or may not prevail is just terrible. And she literally called me and said, we're fighting for the Mahar. I was actually very excited for the first time to be arguing the Mahar issue in Georgia. We, generally speaking, my cases settle. And so we do have Mahar issues that come up in cases, but we settle the issue through negotiation. This was a contested trial. We were going to have to put on evidence about the contract and the video and the signing, and do we have an agreement and all the things. And I was very excited to argue it. And she basically said to me, does the court have no mercy? Does the court not understand that I can't wait? I've been in and out of shelter for the last 2 years since I've been separated. I have no money. I haven't gotten, she had very real injuries as a result of the abuse. She has no health insurance.
No maintenance, nothing.
Nothing. She has nothing. She didn't even have a work permit. So she, as is the story of a lot of survivors, she came on a student visa. Her husband encouraged her to drop out of school to be a wife and stay home. And she agreed. And so she fell out of status. And so she's still pending, waiting for legal She luckily just got a work permit maybe a month or two ago. So she recently is employed, but for the last 2 years since she's been separated from him, hasn't even had employment, and has, literally relied on the charity of others to survive. And so, this is what I'm talking about when I talk about the institutional failings, and even just, the right of a speech. Yes, an interpreter is a civil right, but so is the right to a speedy trial.
Indeed.
And she
Or
doesn't
some
have.
kind of injunctive relief if they're going to drag these things out longer and longer, some kind of something. And especially at the intersection of immigration law and family law. This is a real problem that I remember myself from more than 20 years ago when I was in mostly immigration law, is that a lot of Muslim women end up in this very difficult situation where they have no status, they can't work.
Yep.
Yeah, it's
a tragedy.
Well, before we bring this interview to a close, is there anything else that you'd like to share with our audience? I'm going to take a moment to share my screen because I want people to see the information on how they can contact you. Maybe talk a bit about what kind of services you provide through your consulting business. Sure.
So, as you said in my very generous introduction, so when I left KARAMAH, I started my own practice, and I moved down to Atlanta. I started my own practice, and in my private practice, I do any number of family law issues. I do all of the family law issues: divorce, custody, child support, paternity issues, domestic violence issues, protective orders, the whole 9 yards. And then in my consulting practice, and then I also mentioned that I do provide pro bono legal services through Raksha, through Noor Family Services. So if you guys are in Atlanta and you need and you have you're indigent and may need some support, that is, I can't afford an attorney, email me here. The same email address is fine, and I will try to hook you up with services. And then through consulting, I couldn't let go of all of the awesomeness that I experienced at KARAMAH. So I think it's very to bring my personal story out yet again. I feel that while direct services is impactful and people need direct services on the ground daily, we also need to try to move the needle, continue to move the needle in policy spaces, with judges, with other lawyers, with mental health professionals, with religious leaders. And so I started Sugarlimb Consulting. So I grew up on Sugarlimb Road, which is where I got the name, innocuous, but it's very personal to me. So Sugarlimb Consulting, we provide trainings and do a lot of education. I do a lot of CLEs. I work with various organizations, Muslim and otherwise, informing our communities about family law issues, more generally, Islamic family law issues, domestic violence, sexual assault, hoping to continue some of what I learned at KARAMAH. For KARAMAH, we do technical, Sugarlimb is working with KARAMAH to continue doing technical assistance. KARAMAH's work is central to that. And yeah, so that's what I do. And that phone number on the screen is my office phone. And even though I'm not going into the office, I still get all my voicemail. So feel free to call me and reach me if you need me. And email is always there as well. So I have nothing but gratitude to you, Sarah, for having this interview, having me speak. So much gratitude to KARAMAH. KARAMAH is like my home. Still feel like it is home to me. And so just feeling very blessed to still be affiliated with you all, and for all the many things that I learned and continue to learn.
Well, and that you so generously share, because I think you're right. We need to change the culture. because we can't really get a grip on what's happening in the Muslim community unless we turn the lens on ourselves and talk about what kinds of values we want to espouse and teach our children and demand that people exhibit in their daily lives. So it's sort of a two-way thing. We have to educate ourselves, change the culture within the Muslim community, as well as struggling with a very inflexible legal system, which is what we have to work with. And there also education is key to getting changes that are positive, that actually work the way they're intended and lasting. So thank you for doing this two-way thing, looking outwards and looking inwards. You know, you are a unique person, and I'm so glad that you were able to spend time with us here today.
Oh, I'm so happy. I think I'm very lucky to be doing the work that I do, to feel passionate about the work that I do. And so I'm very grateful. And to your last point, I think the elusive concept of justice, so for people who are of faith, comes maybe more comforting for it to come from a faith-based perspective than to come from our institutions and legal systems that are flawed. And so I think that and KARAMAH is the central place to get that kind of solace that so many survivors are seeking. They're not going to get it from judges who just don't get it, and laws that are antiquated, and it takes a very long time to change. And so hopefully, I mean, it's not to say that faith is a cure-all for everything, but if we can continue to do the education that you all are doing, it provides a lot of solace for a lot of people who need it. So
Amin Ya Rab is all I can say.